The towering pines stood guard, their needles whispering secrets to the wind. Deep within their shadowy embrace lived Hank, a man as much a part of the forest as the sturdy oak trees themselves. He wasn't just a visitor, he was an inhabitant, his calloused hands and weathered face testament to years spent under the open sky. Hank was a hunter, yes, but not in the way some city folks might imagine. He didn't hunt for sport or trophy. He hunted for survival, for the food that kept him strong and the stories that filled his quiet nights. His cabin, a cozy collection of rough-hewn logs, nestled beside a babbling brook that sang a constant lullaby. Smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, a beacon of warmth against the cool mountain air. Inside, the walls were adorned with simple tools, maps of the winding trails, and a few faded photographs of his younger days. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside, was a familiar sound to Hank. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe to never miss a new video. And tell me, where are you watching this video from? I love seeing all different people come together for these stories. He knew the difference between a squirrel scampering and a deer stepping lightly. He could tell by the crunch of leaves if a bear was ambling by or if a bobcat was slinking through the undergrowth. Hank was a man of quiet strength. His eyes, the color of moss after a rain, missed nothing. They held a deep understanding of the wild, an ancient wisdom passed down through generations of woodsmen. He'd seen nearly everything the forest had to offer. Fierce storms that bent trees like reeds, baby fawns hidden among the ferns, and even a rare white stag that seemed to glow in the moonlight. He respected the animals, understanding that they were not just prey, but vital parts of the intricate dance of nature. When he took a life, it was done with gratitude and purpose, ensuring no part went to waste. He carried an old rifle, a trusty companion that had seen him through many a cold winter and unexpected encounter. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool, a protector, and a symbol of his self-reliance. He cleaned it with care, its oiled gleam a reflection of his meticulous nature. But even with all his experience, all his knowledge, and all his tools, Hank had a feeling deep in his bones that something new was stirring in his beloved woods. A feeling he couldn't quite name, a prickle on the back of his neck that wasn't from the chill of the evening. His days began before the sun touched the mountain peaks, with the smell of pine and damp earth filling his lungs. He would check his snares, gather wild herbs, and sometimes spend hours simply observing, watching a hawk circle high above, or a beaver diligently patching its dam. He understood the rhythm of the forest, the subtle shifts that told him when winter was coming or when a new predator had moved into the territory. This connection to the land was his lifeblood, his purpose. It was a simple life, free from the noise and rush of the outside world, a life he wouldn't trade for anything. Yet the quiet hum of his existence was about to be disrupted. Not by a natural event, but by something far more mysterious and unsettling. The forest, which he knew so intimately, was about to show him a secret it had kept hidden for a very long time, a secret that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the wild world. The subtle unease Hank felt in his bones soon turned into something more concrete, a series of strange happenings that began to chip away at the quiet certainty of his life in the woods. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow moving just beyond the edge of his vision. One morning, he found his woodpile scattered, logs rolled haphazardly as if by a giant's clumsy hand. A bear might do such a thing, but the mess was too wide, too deliberate in its disarray, and there were no claw marks or familiar paw prints. Hank simply shrugged it off, attributing it to a particularly rambunctious gust of wind or perhaps a curious, large animal he hadn't encountered before. But then, the noises began. At first, they were just faint thumps in the deep hours of the night, sounds that didn't quite fit the usual symphony of the forest. They weren't the sharp crack of a branch breaking under a deer's hoof, nor the hoot of an owl. These were heavy, muffled thuds, like something massive moving through the undergrowth, far too large and deliberate to be any animal Hank knew. He'd lie awake, listening intently, his ear pressed to the rough log wall of his cabin, trying to place the sound, to give it a name. But it remained nameless, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and orange, a new oddity presented itself. A smell, unlike anything Hank had ever encountered in the wild, drifted through the trees. It wasn't the sweet musk of a buck, nor the damp earthiness of a fox den. This was a strong, unpleasant odor, a mix of wet dog, stale garbage, and something else. Something wild and ancient that made the hair on Hank's arms stand on end. He wrinkled his nose, his keen senses trying to identify the source. But the wind carried it away as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only a lingering question mark in the air. Things started to move. Not just the woodpile, but other objects around his property. His old tin pail, usually kept by the well, was found a dozen yards away, dented. A small stack of kindling he'd left on his porch was toppled, scattered across the steps. It was as if an invisible, mischievous hand was playing tricks on him. Hank, a man of logic and practicality, tried to find reasonable explanations. Perhaps a strong wind had blown the pail, or a curious raccoon had knocked over the kindling. But deep down, he knew these explanations felt thin, stretched too far to cover the growing list of strange occurrences. The thumping noises grew bolder, closer. Sometimes, Hank would hear them just beyond his cabin, a rhythmic pounding that shook the very ground. He'd grab his rifle, step out onto his porch, and scan the dark woods with his flashlight, its beam cutting through the inky blackness. But he would never see anything. Just the endless trees, the deep shadows, and the unsettling silence that followed the sudden cessation of the pounding. It was as if whatever was out there knew he was looking and stopped, waiting for him to go back inside. One afternoon, Hank was out checking his traps by the old creek bed, a place he'd visited countless times. He noticed a series of broken branches high up on the trees, snapped cleanly as if by immense force. These weren't weak branches. They were thick, sturdy limbs that would take considerable effort to break. And they were too high for any bear to reach, even standing on its hind legs. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. It was a clear sign that something unusually large, something immensely powerful was moving through his woods. The feeling of being watched also intensified. He'd be tending his garden or mending a fence, and a sudden cold spot would appear on his back, a sensation of eyes boring into him from the thicket. He'd spin around, his heart thumping, only to find nothing but the familiar, silent forest. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It lingered, a constant, unsettling presence that made his peaceful cabin feel less like a sanctuary and more like a stage for an unseen observer. Hank, the man who knew the forest like the back of his hand, was beginning to realize there was something in these woods he didn't know at all, and it was getting closer. The strange occurrences had been building, a slow, unsettling crescendo that made Hank's nerves hum like a taut bowstring. He'd spent countless hours trying to rationalize the scattered wood, the powerful thumps, the foul smell, and the impossibly broken branches. But his hunter's instinct, honed over decades in the wilderness, told him that something truly out of the ordinary was at play. He was no longer just feeling watched. He was certain of it, the unseen gaze a constant pressure on his back. One crisp autumn morning, the air was sharp with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. Hank decided to venture further than usual, following a game trail that wound deep into a seldom visited part of the forest. He hoped to find answers, or at least a clearer sign of whatever creature was making his life so peculiar. He moved with the quiet grace of a seasoned woodsman, his rifle held loosely, ready. The sun dappled through the canopy, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. The usual sounds of birdsong and rustling critters filled the air, but beneath it all, Hank felt that familiar, heavy silence that always seemed to precede something big. He had been walking for nearly an hour when he came to a small clearing. It was an old logging site, now overgrown with young saplings and thick brush, bordered by a steep, rocky ridge. Hank paused, his eyes scanning the tree line, his ears straining for any unusual sound. That's when he saw it. At the very edge of the clearing, where the thick woods met the base of the ridge, something stood partially hidden by a cluster of tall, dark fir trees. It was far away, perhaps a quarter of a mile, but even from that distance, Hank could tell it was enormous. Taller than any man he had ever seen, and wider too. His breath caught in his throat. He slowly raised his binoculars, his hands steady despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. Through the powerful lenses, the image snapped into focus, and Hank felt a cold wave wash over him. It wasn't a bear. He knew bears. Bears were wide and low to the ground, moving with a lumbering gait. This creature stood upright, like a person, but it was covered from head to toe in thick, dark brown fur that seemed almost black in the shadows. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, its head sunk low into its massive frame. It was massive, truly massive, a towering figure against the backdrop of the trees. It moved with a strange, fluid grace, a slow sway that belied its immense size. For a moment, it just stood there, seemingly looking out over the clearing. Hank held his breath, barely daring to blink, afraid that any sudden movement would make it vanish. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the light, a gnarled tree stump, anything but what his eyes were clearly seeing. But his mind raced, connecting it to the impossible thumps, the high broken branches, the foul smell. Then the creature turned its head slightly. Hank couldn't make out specific features from this distance, but he saw the shape of a head, a powerful neck, and a hint of a face, dark and indistinct, framed by shaggy hair. It wasn't a bear's snout, nor a deer's gentle muzzle. It was something else entirely, something with a human-like outline, but an animal's wildness. It seemed to be looking in his direction, though Hank was well hidden. A tremor ran through him. After what felt like an eternity, the colossal figure took a single, deliberate step back, melting into the deeper shadows of the fir trees. It didn't run, didn't lumber. It simply disappeared. One moment it was there, a dark, imposing silhouette, and the next, only the empty space where it had stood. Hank slowly lowered his binoculars, his hands trembling now. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence of the forest. He stood there for a long time, trying to process what he had just seen. Bigfoot, the stories, the legends, the whispers around campfires. He had always dismissed them as tall tales, fanciful creations of lonely minds. But now, in the quiet depths of his own forest, he had seen it with his own eyes, and it was real. The strange happenings suddenly made terrifying sense. His world, once so predictable, had just opened up to something truly extraordinary and deeply unsettling. He knew he wasn't alone in these woods anymore, and the creature he had just glimpsed was far more than just a large animal. The image of the towering, hairy figure burned itself into Hank's mind. It wasn't just a sighting. It was a revelation that shattered his understanding of the wilderness he called home. The casual uneasiness he'd felt before transformed into a cold, hard knot of fear that settled deep in his gut. The woods no longer felt like a safe haven. They felt like a vast, unpredictable domain where he was no longer at the top of the food chain. His walks became shorter, more cautious. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, his senses hyper-alert, straining to catch any hint of movement or sound. The strange noises, once distant and mysterious, now seemed to draw closer to his cabin. The heavy thumps and guttural grunts were no longer just echoes in the night. They vibrated through the ground, making the windows of his cabin rattle faintly. He imagined those massive feet pressing down on the earth, shaking the very roots of the trees. The foul smell, that unsettling mix of wild animal and something rotten, became a more frequent visitor. It would drift into his cabin through the open windows, sometimes so strong it made him gag. He'd rush to close them, but the scent seemed to cling to the air, reminding him that the creature was nearby, perhaps circling his home just beyond the reach of his sight. The thought made his skin crawl. He started to keep his doors and windows locked, something he hadn't done in years. The simple act of turning the key felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that his solitude was no longer a shield, but a vulnerability. One morning, Hank discovered huge footprints in the soft mud near his creek. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, much too large for a human, much too long for a bear. They were distinctly foot-shaped, with 5 toes, and deeply pressed into the earth, showing the immense weight of the creature that had made them. He knelt, his fingers tracing the outline, a cold dread seeping into him. The prints led directly from the creek bed, up towards his cabin, stopping just shy of his property line. It was a clear message. The creature knew where he lived. The feeling of being watched intensified to an almost unbearable degree. Hank felt eyes on him, even when he was inside, the sturdy log walls feeling suddenly thin and fragile. He'd catch glimpses of movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. A fleeting shadow among the trees, a darker patch in the gloom that would vanish the moment he turned his head directly. He started leaving his rifle leaning against the wall, always within arm's reach. He sharpened his axe, checked his ammunition, and made sure his cabin was as secure as possible. Sleep became a luxury. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside would jolt him awake, his heart hammering in his chest. He'd spend hours staring out his window into the moonlit darkness, the rifle clutched in his hands, waiting, listening. He saw shadows that seemed to move, shapes that shifted, but never a clear, undeniable sight of the creature itself. It was a game of cat and mouse, and Hank felt like the mouse, trapped in his own home. He worried about his safety, a feeling alien to a man who had faced down angry bears and navigated treacherous blizzards without a flicker of fear. This was different. This wasn't a force of nature he understood. It was something unknown, something powerful, and something that seemed to be actively encroaching on his personal space. He wondered what it wanted. Was it curious, hostile, or just asserting its dominance over what it considered its territory? One evening, as he was preparing a simple meal, a heavy thump echoed from the woods, directly behind his cabin. It was so close that a small tremor ran through the floor. The sound was followed by a low, guttural growl, a deep rumble that vibrated in his chest. It wasn't the roar of a bear, nor the snarl of a wolf. It was something far more primitive, something that spoke of raw power and untamed wildness. Hank dropped his knife, his hands clammy. The creature wasn't just near, it was right there, just beyond his cabin walls, making its presence known. His quiet life had been replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. His home, his sanctuary, felt under siege. The constant feeling of being hunted had worn Hank thin. Sleep was a stranger, and every shadow held a potential threat. He'd fortified his cabin as best he could, boarding up loose windows and reinforcing his door. But he knew these were mere delays against a creature of such immense power. The low growls and heavy thumps that had once been distant now felt like they were just outside his walls, sometimes so close he imagined he could feel the vibrations in the very air around him. The foul, musky scent was a permanent fixture, clinging to his clothes and even the inside of his cabin, a constant, sickening reminder of the encroaching presence. One particular night, the air hung heavy and still, not a breath of wind stirring the leaves. The moon, a thin sliver in the inky sky, offered little light, making the woods around Hank's cabin an impenetrable wall of darkness. Hank sat by his small, crackling fire, his old rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the sturdy wooden door. He hadn't bothered with his lamp, preferring the dim, shifting light of the flames, hoping it made him less visible to anything outside. Then it started. Not a thump or a growl this time, but a series of soft, deliberate footsteps. They were heavy, yes, but remarkably quiet for something so large, as if the creature was trying to be sneaky. Each step seemed to shake the ground a tiny bit, a tremor Hank felt in his bones more than heard with his ears. The steps were coming from the direction of the creek, where he had found those massive footprints. They were getting closer. Hank's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that echoed in the quiet cabin. He gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could smell it now, stronger than ever before, that awful, wild odor, filling the air around his home. It was right outside. A moment of chilling silence fell, broken only by the frantic beat of Hank's own heart. Then, a low, deep breath, a huff that sounded huge and ancient, right outside his door. A shadow, darker than the night itself, moved past his window. It was so big it blocked out the faint moonlight, turning the already dark room even blacker for a split second. Hank slowly, carefully, moved to the side of his window, pressing himself against the wall. He risked a quick peek through a small crack in the wooden shutter. And there it was. Standing on two legs, towering over his small porch, was the creature. It was even bigger than he had imagined from his distant sighting in the clearing. Easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, a shaggy, dark brown form that seemed to absorb all the light around it. Its broad shoulders filled the entire width of his porch, and its head, sunk low on its powerful neck, seemed to almost touch the overhang of his roof. Hank couldn't make out its face clearly in the gloom, but he saw the outline of its massive head, its powerful jaw, and the deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with a faint, reddish light. It truly looked like the Bigfoot from the old stories, a creature of myth made flesh. Its fur was matted and thick, giving it an even more formidable appearance. It stood there for a long moment, completely still, its head slightly tilted, as if listening, or perhaps sniffing the air. Hank felt a paralyzing terror grip him. He was a brave man. But this was beyond anything he had ever faced. This was a creature from another time, a beast of legend, standing on his porch right outside his home. Then, slowly, deliberately, a huge, hairy hand reached out. Its fingers were thick, powerful, ending in dark, blunt nails. It touched the wooden frame of his door, tracing the rough grain with an almost curious gentleness. Yet Hank knew the immense power those hands possessed. A soft scrape, like rough bark on wood, filled the sudden quiet. It wasn't trying to break in yet, but its presence was a clear threat, an undeniable assertion of its proximity and its interest. Hank pressed back against the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was no longer just scared, he was terrified. This was real. This was happening. His safe haven was being invaded by a creature that shouldn't exist. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his finger finding the trigger. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was going to be the night. The colossal shadow on his porch, the enormous hairy hand tracing his doorframe, had frozen Hank in place, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was a hunter, a man of the wild. But this was a beast beyond his wildest imaginings, a nightmare made real. The air in his small cabin grew heavy with the creature's musky scent and Hank's own rising terror. He clutched his rifle, its familiar weight a small comfort against the monumental dread. The gentle scrape of the Bigfoot's fingers against the wood ceased. For a moment, a silence descended so profound it felt as if the entire forest held its breath. Then, a low guttural rumble emanated from the creature, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. It wasn't just a growl, it was a deep, resonating challenge, a clear declaration of intent. Suddenly, with a jarring thud that made the entire cabin shudder, the Bigfoot slammed its massive fist against the door. The sturdy wood groaned, splintering faintly where the impact landed. Hank cried out, a sharp, involuntary gasp of fear. This was no longer a curious exploration. This was an attack. The creature wanted in. Another powerful blow, harder this time. The door bowed inward, threatening to burst from its hinges. Hank knew his defenses wouldn't hold for long against such brute force. Panic flared, but it quickly mixed with a primal surge of self-preservation. He had built this cabin with his own hands. It was his sanctuary, his life. He would not let it be breached. He swung his rifle up, aiming at the outline of the door. His hands were shaking, but his hunter's instinct, deeply ingrained, began to take over. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady his aim. He didn't want to hurt the creature, but it was forcing his hand. It was trying to break into his home, threatening his very life. He had no other choice. With a deafening crack that split the night, the Bigfoot slammed its body against the door, and the reinforced timber groaned with a sound of imminent collapse. Hank didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot roared, a thunderous explosion in the confined space of the cabin. The recoil jolted his shoulder, but Hank barely felt it. All his focus was on the door, on the monstrous shape beyond it. The bullet tore through the wood, right where the creature's chest would have been. A chilling shriek, loud and raw, tore through the night, echoing through the silent forest. It wasn't the roar of a wounded bear or the cry of a human. It was a sound of immense pain and primal rage, a sound that would haunt Hank's dreams for years to come. The cabin shook again, not from another attack, but from the sudden, powerful scramble of the creature recoiling from the shot. Hank heard heavy thumps, quick and clumsy, as the Bigfoot stumbled back from the door. Then, a crashing sound as it likely tripped or fell from his porch. The terrible smell seemed to intensify for a moment, mixed with something new. The metallic tang of blood, even through the wood. He quickly reloaded his rifle, his hands still trembling, but his mind now sharp and focused. He stood ready, waiting for another assault, bracing himself for the creature to come around the side of the cabin or perhaps tear through a wall. But the sounds grew fainter, retreating into the darkness. The heavy thumps became more distant, then faded entirely, replaced by the eerie silence of the deep woods. Hank stood there for a long time, rifle raised, listening intently. The quiet was almost more terrifying than the noise. He waited, his heart slowly calming from its frantic pace, but still thrumming with residual fear and a profound sense of shock. He had shot Bigfoot. The thought was impossible, yet undeniably real. He had defended himself, his home, his life. But what had he done? And what would happen next? The forest felt different now, imbued with a new, dark secret that he had unleashed. The echoes of the gunshot faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the forest, leaving Hank alone in the vibrating quiet of his cabin. His rifle, still warm from the shot, felt heavy in his hands. The chilling shriek of the wounded creature still rang in his ears, a sound he knew he would never forget. He listened intently, every nerve ending screaming for a sign of the Bigfoot's return, but there was nothing. Only the distant hoot of an owl and the soft rustle of leaves in a breeze that had finally decided to stir. Slowly, carefully, Hank lowered his rifle. His whole body was trembling, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in his knees and shook him from head to toe. He leaned against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, the cold wood a stark contrast to the burning heat in his chest. He was safe. For now. But the relief was mixed with a potent cocktail of shock, disbelief, and a profound sense of isolation. He stared at the splintered door, a ragged hole where his bullet had passed through. The scent of gunpowder mingled with the lingering, foul odor of the creature, and the faint, metallic tang of blood. He had truly shot it. Bigfoot. The legendary beast, a myth whispered in hushed tones, had been on his porch, and he had fired his rifle to defend his life. The reality of it was almost too much to bear. His mind raced, a whirlwind of questions with no answers. Was it dead? Had he merely wounded it? Would it come back angrier, more determined? He, Hank, the man who knew these woods better than anyone, was completely lost. He didn't know what to do next. He couldn't just open the door and look. The darkness outside felt more menacing than ever, a cloak for unknown dangers. What if it was waiting, just beyond the tree line, ready to ambush him? He spent the next few hours huddled by his fireplace, the rifle across his lap, his eyes darting to every shadow, every creak. The fire, usually a source of comfort, now cast dancing shadows that played tricks on his exhausted mind, making him jump at nothing. As the first faint streaks of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, painting the world in soft grays and pale pinks, Hank finally gathered enough courage to move. He slowly rose, his muscles stiff and aching from the night's ordeal. He had to see. He had to know. He approached the damaged door, his heart once again pounding. He carefully unlatched it, peering out into the early morning light. The porch was empty. The broken wood, the faint metallic smell, and the lingering musky odor were the only signs of the terrifying confrontation. He stepped outside, his rifle still ready, scanning the immediate area. Near the edge of the porch, where the creature had likely fallen, he saw it. A dark, sticky patch on the damp earth, unmistakable against the brown leaves. Blood. And leading away from it, into the deeper woods, were fresh, massive footprints, deeper and more erratic than before, as if the creature was limping, stumbling. They disappeared quickly into the dense undergrowth, swallowed by the forest. Hank followed the trail for a short distance, his hunter's instinct pulling him forward, but a deeper part of him screaming to turn back. He saw more broken branches, higher up than anything a bear could reach, snapped in a hurried, desperate retreat. But the trail soon grew too faint, too tangled in the thick brush. He knew it was useless to pursue. The forest had claimed its secret once more. He returned to his cabin, his mind a jumble of thoughts and emotions. He was alive. He was safe. But his world had irrevocably changed. He had proof of something extraordinary, something that defied all logic and science. And he had wounded it. What would he tell anyone? Who would believe him? He was alone with this incredible, terrifying secret. He sat on his porch, watching the sun rise higher, illuminating a world that felt both familiar and utterly alien. What did he do now? The question hung heavy in the crisp morning air, unanswered and terrifying. The morning after the terrifying encounter had slowly turned into afternoon. Hank had tried to busy himself, patching the splintered door with some spare lumber. But his hands still shook, and his mind kept replaying the events of the night. The sight of the blood on the ground, the massive footprints, the impossible reality of what he had done, it all swirled in his head. He felt a profound isolation, the weight of a secret too incredible to share. Who would believe him? He had no idea what to do, how to process this, or what his next step should be. He was sitting on his porch, nursing a cup of strong, black coffee, staring blankly at the dense tree line, when a new sound began to fill the air. It was a low hum at first, a distant thrumming that Hank, with his keen woodsman's ears, recognized instantly. It was the sound of an engine, a powerful one, growing steadily louder. This wasn't a small plane or a passing car on some distant road. This was something bigger, something approaching fast. The hum quickly escalated into a roaring chop, a sound that ripped through the peaceful forest silence like a tearing cloth. The birds scattered, squawking in alarm, and the small animals darted for cover. Hank stood up, his coffee forgotten, his eyes scanning the sky. He had rarely seen aircraft this deep in the woods, certainly not one making such a commotion. Then, through a break in the canopy, he saw it. A huge black helicopter, sleek and silent except for the thunderous beating of its rotors, emerged from above the treetops. It wasn't a search and rescue chopper nor any kind of civilian aircraft he recognized. It was military-grade, dark and menacing, with no visible markings. It circled once, slowly, directly over his cabin, as if sizing him up. The sheer power of its downdraft bent the tops of the trees and sent a shower of pine needles raining down on his roof. Hank felt a fresh wave of fear, different from the primal terror of facing Bigfoot, but just as chilling. This was a man-made threat, an invasion of his solitude by something equally unknown and far more organized. He instinctively reached for his rifle, which he had placed just inside the door, but hesitated. What was he going to do? Shoot at a helicopter? The helicopter descended slowly, gracefully, towards a small, relatively flat clearing about 100 yards from his cabin, a spot Hank sometimes used for drying herbs. The roaring sound intensified to an almost unbearable level, vibrating through the ground and shaking the very foundations of his home. Dust and leaves swirled violently around the landing zone. As the giant machine settled onto the forest floor, its rotors slowly spun down, gradually quieting until only a soft whirring remained. The sudden silence that followed was heavy, almost oppressive. Hank stood frozen on his porch, watching, his heart pounding once more, but this time with a sense of profound bewilderment. The side door of the helicopter slid open with a soft hiss. Two figures emerged, tall and imposing, dressed in crisp, dark suits. They wore dark sunglasses, even though the sun was now high in the sky, and their faces were unreadable, their expressions hidden. They moved with a practiced, efficient air, carrying no visible weapons, yet radiating an undeniable authority. They looked completely out of place in the wild, untamed forest, like shadows mistakenly dropped into a sunlit painting. They scanned the area, their gaze sweeping over the trees, the cabin, and finally settling on Hank. Then, without a word, they began to walk towards him, their polished shoes crunching softly on the forest floor. Hank felt a strange mix of dread and a bizarre sense of inevitability. How did they know? How could they possibly have known what happened last night? The question screamed in his mind, adding another layer of unsettling mystery to an already unbelievable day. The arrival of these strange, dark-suited men felt less like a coincidence and more like an unwelcome, calculated intrusion. His private world had been shattered, first by a myth, and now by something even more unsettling: the quiet, powerful reach of the government. The two men in dark suits approached Hank's porch with an unnerving calm, their steps making soft, even sounds on the forest floor. Hank stood his ground, rifle still leaning just inside the door, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He watched them, his eyes narrowed, trying to read something in their impassive faces, hidden behind dark sunglasses. They stopped a few feet from his porch, neither smiling nor frowning, just observing him with an intense, unblinking stare. "Mr. Hank Peterson?" the taller of the two men asked, his voice smooth and even, betraying no emotion. He spoke as if he were in an office, not deep in the wilderness. Hank simply nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white. "We're with a special branch of the government," the man continued, reaching into his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, dark leather wallet and flipped it open, showing Hank a badge and an ID card. The details were blurry from Hank's distance and his own state of shock, but the official seal was clear enough. "My name is Agent Thorne, and this is Agent Miller." He gestured to his partner, who remained silent, his gaze fixed on Hank. "Government?" Hank finally managed to croak, his voice rough. "What do you want?" Agent Thorne's lips barely moved as he spoke. "We're here to ask you a few questions about the events that occurred on your property last night, Mr. Peterson, specifically the discharge of your firearm and the target." Hank felt a cold dread spread through him. They knew. They actually knew. His mind reeled. How could they have known so quickly? Had they been watching him? Had they been watching the creature? The implications were staggering, far more unsettling than even the Bigfoot encounter itself. "What target?" Hank tried to play dumb, but his voice wavered. Agent Thorne's gaze was unwavering. "Let's not play games, Mr. Peterson. We detected a unique energy signature consistent with a Class 4 biological anomaly, originating from your location around midnight, followed by a high-caliber rifle shot." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We believe you had an encounter with a cryptid, and you discharged your weapon in self-defense." Cryptid. The word sounded scientific, official, and somehow even more frightening than Bigfoot. Hank felt a wave of dizziness. He had always been a man of facts, of what he could see and touch. Now, he was in a conversation with government agents about Class 4 biological anomalies and cryptids. It tried to get into my cabin," Hank stammered, the words tumbling out. "It was huge, covered in hair like Bigfoot. I had no choice. It was going to break down my door. Agent Thorne nodded slowly, as if this was precisely the answer he expected. We understand. Can you describe the creature in more detail? Its size, coloring, any distinguishing features? Its behavior leading up to the incident? Hank, still reeling, found himself recounting the terrifying night. He described the initial strange happenings, the scattered wood, the foul smell, the thumping noises. He spoke of his first distant sighting, and then the creature's relentless approach to his cabin, the massive footprints, the feeling of being watched. He told them about the Bigfoot on his porch, its sheer size, the glowing eyes he thought he'd seen, and the powerful blows against his door. He left out no detail, driven by a strange need to validate his unbelievable experience to these unreadable men. Agent Miller, who had been silent until now, pulled out a small notepad and began to jot down notes, his pen scratching softly. He occasionally glanced up, his dark glasses reflecting the forest around them, but his eyes never met Hank's. And after you fired? Agent Thorne pressed, his voice still calm, almost clinical. What happened then? It shrieked, Hank said, the sound still vivid in his memory. A terrible sound. And then it stumbled back, off the porch. I heard it crashing through the woods, retreating. I found blood in the morning and tracks leading away, like it was hurt. Agent Thorne exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance with Agent Miller. Blood samples. Excellent. We'll need to collect those, and the projectile, if you can locate it. Hank felt a chill. These men weren't just asking questions. They were gathering evidence. This wasn't just a debriefing. It was an investigation into something that supposedly didn't exist. His simple, isolated life was now tangled in a web of secrets and government operations, all because of a single, terrifying night. The forest, once his sanctuary, now felt like a stage, and he, the reluctant star of a play he never asked to be in. Hank had finished telling the agents everything, from the first odd noises to the blood he found this morning. Agent Miller had filled several pages in his notepad, and Agent Thorne had listened with an almost unsettling lack of surprise. The sun, now high in the sky, glinted off their dark sunglasses, making their faces even harder to read. The roaring silence of the helicopter, parked a short distance away, added to the strange, unreal atmosphere. After a long pause, Agent Thorne finally spoke, his voice low and firm. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Peterson. This information is vital. He then shifted his stance, his body language subtly changing, becoming more direct, more imposing. Now, we need to discuss the future. Hank felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The future? What do you mean? What you experienced last night, and what you saw, Agent Thorne began, sweeping a hand towards the vast expanse of trees, is a matter of national security. The existence of these creatures, these cryptids, as you called them, is not publicly known, and it must remain that way. Hank's eyes widened. You mean, you want me to keep quiet? Precisely. Agent Miller spoke for the first time, his voice deeper than Thorne's, equally devoid of warmth. This information could cause widespread panic, disrupt ecosystems, and lead to irresponsible human behavior. It's for the greater good that this remains a secret. Agent Thorne stepped closer, his shadow falling over Hank. You are not to speak of this to anyone, Mr. Peterson. Not to friends, not to family, not to any local authorities. Not a single word. What happened here stays here. Hank felt a wave of indignation mixed with his fear. But I saw it. It tried to kill me. Aren't people supposed to know about something like this? People are not equipped to handle this knowledge, Thorne replied, his voice still calm, but with an underlying steel that brooked no argument. The government has protocols in place to manage these situations. Your cooperation is essential to maintaining order and preventing chaos. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. We understand this is a lot to ask, but the implications of this information getting out are severe. We are prepared to offer you assistance, if needed. Relocation, financial support, whatever you require to ensure your silence and safety. Hank shook his head slowly, trying to process it all. So, you just want me to pretend it never happened? For all intents and purposes, yes. Agent Miller chimed in. You had a bear encounter, perhaps? Or you heard some loud noises. Anything but the truth. We will handle everything else. Thorne continued. We will also be sending in a team to conduct a thorough sweep of the area. They will collect all evidence, including the blood samples you mentioned, and ensure that no trace of the incident remains. This is to protect the public, and frankly, to protect you. If word gets out that you've encountered one of these creatures, your life could become very complicated. Hank stared at them, his mind reeling. They weren't asking, they were telling. They weren't concerned about his feelings, they were concerned about control. The enormity of what they were asking him to do, to deny his own experience, was almost as shocking as seeing Bigfoot itself. What if I don't? Hank asked, his voice barely a whisper, testing the boundaries. Agent Thorne's expression didn't change, but his eyes, behind the dark lenses, seemed to narrow slightly. Mr. Peterson, we sincerely hope it won't come to that. We prefer cooperation. But understand this. We have ways of ensuring compliance, and those ways are far less pleasant than a simple agreement. His voice was still soft, but the threat was unmistakable. It wasn't just a suggestion. It was an order. Hank looked from Thorne to Miller, then back to the sleek, black helicopter that sat like a silent predator in his clearing. He was a simple woodsman, a man who lived by the rules of nature. These men, with their dark suits and quiet threats, represented a power far greater and more mysterious than anything he had ever known. He knew, deep in his heart, that he had no real choice. His incredible, terrifying secret would have to remain just that, a secret. The unspoken threat from Agent Thorne hung heavy in the air, a cold, invisible leash on Hank's words. He looked at the two unblinking figures, then at the silent helicopter, then back to the splintered door of his cabin, a constant reminder of the impossible truth. He was a simple man, a hunter, not a spy or a conspirator. But he understood power, and he knew when he was outmatched. All right, Hank said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual steady calm. I won't say anything, to anyone. Agent Thorne gave a curt nod, a subtle easing of his rigid posture. A wise decision, Mr. Peterson. It's for the best, for everyone. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small metallic card, featureless except for a series of numbers. This is a direct contact number. Should anything else unusual occur, or should you have any questions you feel you cannot address through conventional means, you are to call this number immediately. Only this number. Hank took the card. It felt cold and alien in his rough hands, another piece of the strange new world he had stumbled into. What about the creature? He asked, his gaze drifting towards the dense woods where the Bigfoot had disappeared. What happens to it? Agent Miller, who had been quietly closing his notepad, spoke up. Our teams will be tracking it. We will assess its condition and take appropriate measures. Rest assured, the situation will be handled." His tone was flat, offering no comfort, only a sense of professional detachment. "You won't kill it, will you?" Hank asked, a flicker of something akin to regret in his eyes. Despite the terror, despite the attack, there was still a part of him, the hunter who respected life, that felt a strange connection to the magnificent, terrifying beast. Agent Thorne merely shrugged, a small, non-committal gesture. "Our priority is public safety and the integrity of classified information. The creature's well-being is secondary to those concerns." The answer was blunt, a clear indication of their priorities. Hank realized then that his moral questions meant nothing to these men. They operated on a different plane with different rules. He simply nodded again, a hollow feeling growing in his chest. The agents didn't linger. Thorne gave him a final, piercing look that seemed to reinforce the weight of his new secret. "Remember our discussion, Mr. Peterson." Total silence. Then, with another nod to Miller, they turned and walked back towards the helicopter. Their movements were swift and efficient, their dark suits a stark contrast against the green and brown of the forest. Hank watched as they re-entered the helicopter. The side door hissed shut, and almost immediately, the rotors began to whir. Slowly at first, then building into a deafening roar. Dust and leaves swirled around the machine again as it lifted off the ground, ascending gracefully into the sky. It hovered for a moment, a black silhouette against the bright blue, then pivoted and sped away, vanishing over the distant tree line as quickly as it had arrived. The sudden return to silence was almost painful. Hank stood alone on his porch, the metallic card still clutched in his hand. He was confused, his mind a jumble of what he had seen, what he had done, and what he had just been told. He was scared, not just of the creature, but of the silent, unseen power that had descended upon his remote home. His life, once a simple tapestry of sunrises, forest sounds, and the quiet satisfaction of self-sufficiency, was now tangled with something far larger, far darker. He had seen a creature of myth, wounded it, and then been ordered by the government to pretend it never happened. The very air around him felt different, heavier, laden with the weight of his forced silence. He knew he had promised to keep quiet, but the secret felt like a living thing inside him, a heavy burden that would never truly go away. He was a man with an impossible truth, now forced to live a lie. And the forest, his once familiar friend, now held secrets that even he, its most devoted inhabitant, was not allowed to speak of. The thrum of the helicopter had faded into the distant hum of the forest, leaving Hank standing alone on his porch, the contact card feeling heavy and cold in his hand. He watched the empty sky for a long time, as if expecting the blackbird to return. But it didn't. Just the familiar trees, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the distant call of a hawk. Yet, nothing felt familiar anymore. His peaceful, predictable life in the woods was gone, replaced by a bewildering new reality. He tried to go back to his routines. He fixed the splintered door properly, though the hole where his bullet had passed remained a stark reminder. He chopped wood, checked his traps, and tended his small garden. But his heart wasn't in it. Every snap of a twig, every shadow that shifted, sent a jolt of anxiety through him. The forest, once his comforting friend, now felt like a place of hidden eyes and unspoken dangers. He knew what lurked within its depths, and that knowledge was a heavy, constant weight. Sleep remained elusive. When he did manage to drift off, He was haunted by dreams of massive, glowing eyes in the darkness, of heavy fists pounding on his door, and the chilling shriek of the wounded Bigfoot. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his rifle clutched tightly, staring out into the moonlit woods, half expecting to see the towering figure on his porch again. The government's visit had added another layer to his torment. He couldn't shake the image of Agent Thorne's unreadable face or the quiet, steel-edged threat in his voice. He understood why they wanted to keep it a secret. National security, public panic, chaos. But it felt wrong, a deep betrayal of truth. He, a man of the wild, was now forced to live a lie, to deny the most incredible thing he had ever witnessed. He often thought about the Bigfoot. Was it still alive? Had the government teams found it? He scanned the forest more intently now, not just for game, but for any sign, any confirmation that the creature was either gone or still out there. He found nothing, no fresh tracks, no new signs of massive broken branches. The forest had seemingly swallowed its secret whole, leaving Hank to carry the burden alone. The metallic contact card remained tucked away in his cabin, a constant reminder of the unseen forces that now dictated his silence. He sometimes wondered if he should call it, just to hear a human voice, to ask a question that gnawed at him. But fear held him back. Fear of what they might say or what they might do if he seemed to waver in his promise. He couldn't talk to anyone. His closest friend, a fellow hunter named Old Man Hemlock, who lived a few miles away, would simply dismiss it as a tall tale, or worse, think Hank was losing his mind. How could he explain giant, hairy creatures and black helicopters to someone who believed the biggest mystery in the woods was a particularly elusive deer? The isolation became profound. He was living with a truth that separated him from everyone else. His love for the forest, once pure and uncomplicated, was now tinged with a permanent melancholy. He still appreciated the beauty of a sunrise, the quiet peace of the babbling brook. But there was always an underlying tension, a sense of something lurking just beyond the visible. He knew too much. He had seen too much. And the knowledge had changed him, turning the confident, self-reliant woodsman into a wary, haunted man. Hank tried to tell himself that life would eventually go back to normal, that the memory would fade, that the fear would lessen. But every time he looked at the dented spot on his door or caught a whiff of a strange scent on the wind, he knew it wasn't true. He couldn't forget. The image of Bigfoot, the roar of the gunshot, the quiet menace of the government agents. These things were now woven into the fabric of his being, a permanent part of who he was. His life after Bigfoot was not a return to normal, but a new, shadowed existence, forever marked by the impossible secret he carried. Months turned into seasons, and the seasons cycled through the forest, painting the trees with vibrant greens, then fiery reds, then stark whites. Hank continued his solitary life, but the rhythm was broken, the peace forever shattered. He still rose with the sun, still walked the familiar trails, but his steps were slower, his gaze more distant. The weight of his secret, the unbelievable truth of Bigfoot, and the chilling reach of the government pressed down on him with an invisible force. He often found himself sitting on his porch, staring into the deep woods, pondering the mysteries that now enveloped his existence. He wondered about Bigfoot. Was it still out there, nursing its wound, lurking in the shadows? Or had the government's teams found it, silenced it, perhaps even taken it away to some secret lab he'd only read about in old sci-fi books? The thought filled him with a strange mix of relief and a profound sadness. He had defended himself, but he couldn't shake the image of the creature's immense power, its primal shriek of pain. A part of him, the old hunter's heart, felt a pang for the wild beast he had brought down. But mostly, he wondered about the government. Why the intense secrecy? Agent Thorne's words about national security and public panic played over and over in his mind. Was it really to protect people? Or was it something more? Did they capture these creatures often? Did they study them? Did they know where Bigfoot came from, or why it seemed to be drawn to his cabin? The metallic card with the mysterious number remained tucked in a hidden drawer, a symbol of the vast, shadowy world that had briefly intersected with his own. He never called it, fearing what might happen if he showed too much curiosity. The forest itself seemed to hold a new, silent pact with him. He still understood its language, the whisper of the wind, the call of a distant bird. But now, every sound was filtered through the memory of a deep growl, every shadow through the image of a towering, hairy figure. The feeling of being watched never fully went away. It had become a permanent part of his senses, a low hum beneath the surface of his awareness. He'd glance up, convinced he'd seen a movement, a glint of an eye, only to find nothing but trees. Yet, the feeling persisted. Sometimes, a friend from the nearest town would stop by, bringing supplies or just for a chat. Hank would sit with them, sharing coffee, listening to their talk of mundane things, weather, local gossip, the price of lumber. He'd nod, smile, and offer a quiet comment, all the while knowing he held a secret that would shock them to their core. The casual conversation felt hollow, a performance he was forced to give. He saw the world differently now, knowing that beneath the surface of ordinary life, impossible things existed, and powerful forces worked to keep them hidden. He knew he would never forget that night. The terror, the gunshot, the shriek, the dark suits and the black helicopter. It was all burned into his memory, a permanent scar on his soul. It had changed him from a man who simply lived in the wilderness to a keeper of its most incredible secret. He was a witness to something extraordinary, and that made him extraordinary too, in a way he never wanted to be. The mystery lingered, a quiet hum in his mind. And Hank knew he would carry it with him to his grave, a testament to the night he shot Bigfoot in self-defense, and the government showed up hours later,